The day my father called me a bastard in open court, I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, it did. Somewhere behind my ribs, something old and tired finally broke. But I smiled because I had been waiting for exactly that moment for 3 years, and I was ready. Let me back up. My father built Hargrove Capital from nothing. That's the version he tells at dinner parties, the one where he's a self-made man, a visionary, a patriarch. The version where my mother is a footnote and I'm a prop. He started the firm in a rented office on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like mildew and ambition, and by the time I was 12, we had moved into a house with a gate and a circular driveway and a housekeeper named Mrs. Park, who made soup on Fridays. I watched him build it. I watched him miss my baseball games and my high school graduation. And the night I got into Georgetown, which he found out about 2 days later via text because he was in Singapore, I watched and I said nothing because that was what you did in our family. You were grateful, you were quiet. You performed well at the right occasions, and you didn't ask for things that made him uncomfortable. I was good at it. Too good, maybe. After college, I joined the firm. Not because he asked, he didn't ask, not directly. But there was a conversation over dinner when I was 22 where he said, in that offhand way of his, that it would be a shame if everything he'd built went to people who didn't carry the name. My mother looked at her plate. I understood what was being said. I said yes. For 6 years, I worked at Hargrove Capital. I started at the bottom the way he insisted, because he didn't want anyone to say I got special treatment, which was its own kind of irony since his college roommate ran the competing firm across town, and they played golf every other Thursday. I worked the hours, I learned the accounts. I brought in 2 clients in my 3rd year that added 7 figures to our annual revenue. My father mentioned it once, in passing, to someone else. Then his wife came into the picture. He'd been divorced from my mother for 4 years by then. Clean split, or as clean as these things get. She got the house in Connecticut. He kept the Manhattan apartment, and I kept living in the space between them, visiting each on alternating holidays like a piece of furniture being rotated between storage units. I was used to it. Her name was Diane. She was 41 to his 58, which wasn't the part that bothered me. What bothered me was the way she looked at the firm. Not like a business, like an inheritance she was already calculating. She had a son from her first marriage. Crispin, 26, soft hands, the kind of guy who uses the word ecosystem when talking about networking. He joined the firm 8 months after they got married. My father introduced him at the staff meeting as someone with fresh eyes, and I sat in the back row and thought about the 7 figures I had brought in and said nothing. That was my first mistake, the silence. Crispin moved fast. I'll give him that. He wasn't stupid, just strategic in the way people are when they have nothing to lose and someone else's platform to stand on. He made friends with the junior analysts. He took my father to lunch. He laughed at things that weren't funny and remembered the names of people's children and pets. And within a year, he had positioned himself as indispensable in a way I had never bothered to. Because I had assumed competence was enough. It isn't. I know that now. The shift happened gradually, and then all at once, which is how most things happen that you don't want to see. I noticed I was being left off emails, then off meetings. Then my father restructured the senior leadership team, and my title changed from senior director to strategic advisor, which sounds important and means nothing. When I asked him about it directly, he said I was being sensitive. He said Crispin had different strengths. He said the firm needed new energy. I went home that night and sat in my apartment for a long time without turning on any lights. I'm not going to pretend I handled the next few months gracefully. I didn't sleep well. I stopped going to the gym. I had a version of the same circular argument with myself every morning. Stay and fight, or leave and let them win. As if those were the only 2 options, and as if winning was still something I could define. My mother called me every Sunday, and I told her I was fine in the voice. That means I'm not fine, and she knew it, and didn't push, which was its own kind of love. What I did do during those months was pay attention. I had access to files that Crispin didn't know I still had access to. Not because I was snooping, because no one had bothered to revoke my permissions after the restructure, which tells you something about how thorough the whole operation was. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was just doing the job I'd always done, reading the accounts I'd always read, and one afternoon in October I found something that didn't add up. It was a transfer, internal, between 2 subsidiary accounts routed through a holding company I didn't recognize. The amount wasn't enormous, just under $40,000, but the routing made no sense for a legitimate transaction. I looked at it for a long time, Then I looked at the date. It was 3 days before Crispin had joined the firm. I didn't say anything. I went back further. There were 7 more. Different amounts, different dates, all routed through the same holding company. Total, over 2 years, a little under $400,000. Moving in a pattern that looked, to anyone who knew how to read it, like a man setting up a parallel account structure outside the firm's official books. The holding company was registered in Delaware. Standard enough. But the registered agent's name was one I recognized. It was the maiden name of Diane's sister. I sat with that information for 6 weeks. I made copies. I organized everything into a folder on an encrypted drive that I kept in my desk at home, not at the office. I talked to no one. I did not confront my father. I did not confront Diane. I went to work every day and sat in my irrelevant title and did my irrelevant job, and I waited because I had learned something important in 6 years of watching my father operate. You don't play the card until the moment is right. You wait, you let them feel safe, and then you use it. The moment came in February. My father called me into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. With that particular combination of warmth and tension that I had learned meant something uncomfortable was about to be delivered with a bow on it. He had his hands folded on the desk. Diane was not there, which surprised me, and then didn't. He told me he was restructuring my role again, this time out of the firm entirely. He framed it as an opportunity, a buyout of my equity stake, generous terms, a chance to pursue other avenues. He used the phrase fresh chapter twice. He looked at me the way people look at you when they've already decided, and they're just waiting for you to absorb it. I asked him if Crispin was taking my position. He said Crispin had demonstrated strong leadership potential. I said I had brought in the Whitmore account and the Delacroix account, and that together they represented 11% of the firm's annual revenue. He said that was true and that he appreciated my contributions. I said I'd like some time to review the buyout terms. He said, of course, take a week. Then he stood up, which was his way of ending conversations, and I walked out of that office and down the elevator and out onto the street, and I stood in the February cold for a few minutes just breathing. I called my lawyer from the sidewalk. Not a family friend, not someone my father had ever recommended. My own lawyer, a woman named Audra Finch, who I had hired 8 months earlier. When I first started keeping the folder, I told her it was time. The next 3 weeks were the most focused I have ever been in my life. Audra reviewed everything I had compiled. She brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet man who wore the same brown jacket every time I saw him, and who had the specific kind of energy that comes from spending 20 years finding money people thought they'd hidden. He went through the transfers, the holding company structure, the registered agent connection. At the end of 2 weeks, he produced a 30-page report. I read every page twice. The case was clear. What my father had been doing wasn't just ethically questionable. It was a breach of fiduciary duty to the firm's minority shareholders, several of whom were outside investors with legal standing to sue. The money hadn't disappeared. It had been rerouted systematically in a way that appeared to be setting up a parallel asset base, potentially for a separation of certain assets ahead of any future litigation or divorce settlement. Audra said we had 3 options. I chose the one that required the most patience. We filed a shareholder derivative action in civil court, not in my name, through a small investment group that held a minor equity position in the firm. People Audra knew who were willing to lend their standing to the action. My name was not on the initial filing. My father didn't know I was involved. That lasted about 3 weeks. He called me on a Sunday. The warmth was gone this time. He said he knew I was behind it. He said I was making a mistake I couldn't take back. He said things about loyalty and family that, coming from him, had a particular texture, like a word you've heard so many times it stops meaning anything. I let him talk. When he was done, I said I'd see him in court, and I hung up. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in late March. I wore the gray suit I'd bought 2 years earlier for a client presentation, the one my mother once said made me look like I knew what I was doing. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Civil proceedings usually are. My father was there with his attorney, a senior partner from a firm I recognized. Diane was in the gallery. Crispin was not there, which told me his attorney had advised against it. For the first 2 hours it was procedural. Motions, responses, the forensic accountant's preliminary testimony. My father sat very still in the way that people sit when they are controlling something. I watched him and felt almost nothing. Then his attorney made a move I had not anticipated, in an attempt to undermine my standing as a credible party to the action. Even though I was not technically the named plaintiff, He raised my personal history with the firm. He suggested my involvement was motivated by personal grievance, not legitimate shareholder concern. He was trying to reframe the entire proceeding as a disgruntled family drama rather than a financial misconduct case. My father, when given the opportunity to speak to the character of the parties involved, said something that he had clearly been holding for a long time. He said I had always had difficulty accepting limits. He said the firm needed leadership that understood long-term vision, not just short-term performance. And then, looking at me from across the room with the courtroom very quiet, he said that perhaps the difficulty was that I had never really understood what it meant to be a Hargrove. And then he said it. He said, "You're not really one of us. You never have been." I heard someone in the gallery take a breath. The judge's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved. Audra put her pen down very carefully, and I smiled. Not a performance, not a tactic. It just came out of me, this quiet, tired smile, because he had just handed me the only thing I still needed. I had been waiting to see if he would say it out loud. I had suspected, for over a year, that this was somewhere underneath all of it, the restructuring, the erasure, the buyout offer. I had suspected that the story he was telling himself wasn't "I'm making a business decision," but something older and uglier. And now he had said it in open court, on the record, in front of a judge. Audra stood up. She requested a brief recess. The judge granted it. In the hallway, I opened the bag I had carried in that morning. I took out a manila envelope that I had sealed 3 weeks earlier, and not opened since. I handed it to Audra without a word, because she already knew what was in it. 2 years ago, when things had first started to feel wrong, I had done something I had never told anyone. I'd contacted a private genealogy service, the kind that matches DNA records across their database, and submitted my own sample. Standard enough. But I had also, through some careful research and a fair amount of luck, obtained a sample from my father that had been submitted to a different service years earlier, before these platforms started cross-referencing. Both samples, under anonymized IDs, had eventually been flagged as a match in the shared database. The report was 12 pages. The match was confirmed at the highest confidence level their system provides. My father and I shared DNA consistent with a first-degree biological relationship. In other words, I was exactly who I had always been told I was. The point was never to prove I was his son. The point was that he had just testified, implicitly, under oath, in a proceeding where his credibility was central to his defense, that I wasn't. And I had documentation proving the opposite. I'm not going to over-dramatize what happened when Audra presented the report. Courts don't gasp the way movies suggest. The judge reviewed the document quietly, and then looked at my father's attorney for a long moment. His attorney asked for a recess. My father looked at the table. Diane, from the gallery, had gone the color of old paper. What followed over the next several weeks was largely administrative, which is what justice usually looks like up close. Not dramatic, just slow and thorough. The derivative action proceeded. The forensic accountant's report was admitted. The holding company's records, once subpoenaed, confirmed the routing structure. The registered agent connection to Diane's family became part of the formal discovery record. My father settled. The terms are confidential, which is standard, but the settlement restored equity positions and required structural changes to the firm's financial reporting processes. The attorney, who had made the "not one of us" argument, withdrew from the case shortly before settlement. Crispin left the firm 4 months later. I heard through a former colleague that he'd moved to Denver. I don't know if that's true, and I find I don't particularly need to find out. My father and I have not spoken since the day of the hearing. My mother knows what happened, in the broad strokes. I told her over the phone on a Sunday night, the same call we'd been having every week for years, and there was a long silence before she said, "I always wondered if it would come to this." I didn't ask what she meant by that. Some things you carry for the person who said them without needing to understand. I'm not at Hargrove Capital anymore. I left 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized. Not dramatically. I gave notice, finished what I was working on, said goodbye to the people who had been kind to me there. There were a few. There always are, even in the places that disappoint you. I started something smaller last year, just me and 2 people I trust, working out of a rented space on the 4th floor of a building that doesn't smell like anything in particular. We don't have a gate or a circular driveway or a portrait of a patriarch in the lobby. We have a coffee maker that takes too long, and a shared calendar that is always slightly behind, and a client list that is short but mine. On the wall behind my desk, I have one photograph. It's a picture of the first office my father ever rented. I found it in an old box at my mother's house years ago, before any of this. A third-floor walk-up, mildew and ambition. He looks young in the photo and a little unsure of himself, which is the version of him I find easiest to understand. I'm not carrying anger about it. I'm not performing forgiveness either. The truth is, I think I spent most of my life trying to earn something that was never structured to be earned. From someone who needed to believe he was the only one who had ever built anything. That's a specific kind of grief. And it takes a specific kind of time. What I know is this: I did the work. I kept the records. I waited until the moment was right. And when he said, in a room full of people, that I was not really one of them, I was ready to show exactly who I was. That's mine. He can't take it back.